Hi guys, welcome back to the last day of school and the last chapter of Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. And this is a sad day for me, but I'm still going to be doing some like virtual field trips over the summer and some, little stuff like that. I'll try maybe every once in a while to have a Google Meet for all of us, just to say hey, now that we know how to do it and we're pretty good at it. So without further ado, this is Chapter 8, The Fighter Quarreler's Cure. Joan Russell opened her blue eyes and saw that it was morning. She saw also that her twin sister Anne was still asleep. Joan reached over and gave Anne a little pinch. "Wake up, Anne," she said, making her voice scary and urgent. "Wake up quickly. There's a big black spider in the bed and it's on your side." Anne woke up with a squeal, leaped out of bed, stubbed her toe on the box of paints she had left on the floor the night before, banged her funny bone on the door, and went screaming into her mother's and father's room. "Mother! Daddy! There's a big black spider on our side of the bed." "Mother! Daddy!" Mrs. Russell sighed, sat up, reached for her robe. She said in a low, calm voice, "Anne, you didn't fall for that old trick again, did you?" Anne grabbed her mother's arm and jumped up and down, squealing, "But Mother, Joan said so. It's a big black spider." Mr. Russell turned over and yawned. He said, Stop jumping and squealing and listen. If there's a big black spider in the bed, and it is highly unlikely, then why is Joan still lying there staring at the ceiling and waiting to be bitten and to be spanked?" he added in a loud voice. Anne stopped squealing and listened gravely to her father, but when he finished speaking, she said, "But Joan said there was a spider, Daddy. She said there was." Her daddy said, "Last one dressed gets the littlest melon," and he jumped out of bed and chased Anne out of the room, roaring like a lion. Mr. Russell sang gaily in the shower, but Mrs. Russell frowned as she dressed, for from the children's room she could hear, "That's my sock, give it to me. 'Tis not, it's mine, give it back." Then the sound of a slap. "Mother, Anne's slapping me." "That's my petticoat. You're putting on my petticoat. Give it to me." "'Tis not, 'tis mine." Sound of another slap. "That's mine. No, that's mine. 'Tis not, 'tis too." Slap, bang, crash, running steps. "Mother!" Mrs. Russell said to herself, quarreling from the minute they get up until they go to bed at night. "I do not believe that I can stand another day of it." She ran downstairs and began jamming the oranges into the squeezer. Mr. Russell came whistling in to breakfast. He said mildly, "Oh, scrambled eggs again?" "I was hoping for sausages and buckwheat cakes." Mrs. Russell said, "We had sausages and buckwheat cakes yesterday morning." Mr. Russell said, "What about brook trout? Bill Smith has them nearly every morning." Mrs. Russell said crossly, "Perhaps that is why he looks like a trout and his wife looks like a big, great halibut." Mr. Russell peered over the top of his morning paper. "You know, sweetheart, I think that the children's fighting and quarreling is making you irritable." Mrs. Russell said, "I think it is too. In fact, it is driving me crazy. Just listen to them." From the upper hall they could hear, "It's my turn to go down first, Joan." "'Tis not, it's my turn." "You were first yesterday. You know you were." "But last night you traded your first turn for my pink crayon." "I did not." "You did too." "Cheater." "Double cheater." In came the twins. Joan looked at her melon and then at Anne. She said, "Anne's melon is the biggest. She always gets the biggest and the most of everything." Their daddy said, "As a matter of fact, ladies, I have the biggest melon because I was the first one dressed. Now hush." And he glared at them. The twins sat meekly down to the breakfast table. They had taken but 2 bites, however, when Anne poked Joan and hissed, "I got the most cereal." Ha ha ha. Joan hissed back, "Yes, but I have 3 pieces of bacon and you only have 2. Anne looked, and sure enough, Joan did have 3 pieces. She grabbed one, but Joan snatched her wrist, and in the ensuing scuffle, they managed to tip over Anne's milk and spill it all over the front of their nice blue pleated skirts. Their daddy spanked them. Their mother sponged them off as they left for school, red-eyed and miserable, but still quarreling. As they rounded the corner, their mother could hear, "That big tablet is mine. 'Tis not. 'Tis too." After Mr. Russell had left for the office, Mrs. Russell picked up the telephone and called her friend Mrs. Quittrick. She said, "Mrs. Quittrick, this is Mrs. Russell, the twins' mother, and I want to know if Jasper and Myrtle ever quarrel." "Oh, my dear," said Mrs. Quittrick, "all children quarrel. Why, yes, Myrtle hit Jasper with her big doll, and the eyes came out, and then Jasper hit Myrtle with the little hammer out of his nice new toolbox, and the head came off with the hammer, and I just told them I wouldn't have them breaking up their toys that way." Mrs. Russell said, "But the children, weren't they hurt?" Mrs. Quittrick said, "Why, I didn't notice. I was so angry at them for breaking their lovely toys, and the doll hospital won't be open to put Myrtle's doll eyes back in for 2 weeks, and you know how hard it is to get hammers these days." Mrs. Russell said, "Well, thank you anyway, Mrs. Quittrick," and then hung up. She poured herself another cup of coffee, and while she drank it, she thought and thought about her little fighter quarrelers. Then she had an idea. She thought she would call Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle and ask her what to do. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle would know if anyone would. She called Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle and said, "Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, I am Mrs. Russell, the mother of Anne and Joan." Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Oh, yes, the twins, such darling little girls, and so pretty." Mrs. Russell said, "But they quarrel so, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. They begin fighting the moment they open their eyes in the morning, and they don't stop until they fall asleep from exhaustion. It is dreadful, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. You should hear 'em." Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Oh, I know. That's my sock. No, it's mine. That's my box. No, it's mine. 'Tis not. 'Tis too. You have the most. You're a pig." Mrs. Russell said, "Oh, why, Miss Piggle-Wiggle, you must have heard them. I was hoping that they didn't quarrel when they were at your house." Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "No, I haven't heard Anne and Joan, but I have heard hundreds of other children. You see, fighter quarreleritis is a common children's disease, and it's very contagious, but very easy to cure." "Easy to cure? Oh, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, how?" asked Mrs. Russell. "Well," said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, "in the first place, fighting and quarreling are merely just habits. One morning a child wakens and feels cross, and so instead of smiling at his little brother and saying good morning, he glares at his little brother and shouts, 'You've got my shirt!' The little brother says, 'I have not,' because he hasn't, and the cross child says, 'You have to, you have to,' and the quarreling has begun. The next morning, both children have the fighter quarreleritis, and they both wake up and begin shouting rudely at each other. It soon becomes a habit, and they forget how to be courteous. Now, Mrs. Russell, I believe that if fighter quarrelers could hear themselves as others hear them, and see themselves as others see them, they would soon realize how unpleasant they were, and they would be cured. In order to do this with Anne and Joan, you and Mr. Russell will have to pretend to be Anne and Joan. First, however, you must write down every single fighting thing that the children say. Begin with this morning and keep a careful record of the whole day. Say nothing to the twins, but tomorrow you and Mr. Russell repeat their quarrels." I do not believe that it will be necessary to slap and pinch, but be sure to be as loud and noisy as you can. Don't laugh, and don't let the children know that it is just a game. Look quarrelsome, as well as acting quarrelsome. One day is usually sufficient. Mrs. Russell said, "Every morning Joan tells Anne that there's a big black spider in the bed on Anne's side, and Anne comes screaming into our room. Should Mr. Russell and I do that?" My, said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. "That is the way Billy and Tommy Peters used to start the day, only Billy told Tommy it was a cobra." "Well, cobra or black spider, you and Mr. Russell do the same. Goodbye and good luck." After saying goodbye to Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, Mrs. Russell sat down and wrote down every word of Anne and Joan's morning quarreling that she could remember. After school, she purposely gave one of them a bigger apple than the other, and then followed them around and wrote down the quarreling. She stayed in their room while they undressed for bed and took notes. Fortunately, the children were very productive and fought about the amount of toothpaste on their toothbrushes, whose turn it was for the shower, whose pillow was the softest, the amount of room they had in the bed, who had the most covers, whose turn it was to turn off the light, who had the biggest feet, whose mouth opened the widest, who had the most teeth, everything. My, they were naughty and disagreeable. When she had finished writing it all down, Mrs. Russell handed a copy to Mr. Russell and told him about Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. He thought it was a wonderful idea and studied his part carefully. The next morning, Joan opened her blue eyes and was just reaching out to pinch Anne when she heard a commotion in her mother and Daddy's room, and suddenly the door flew open and in came Mrs. Russell, clutching her bathrobe and squealing, "Anne, Joan, come quick! There's a big black spider in our bed and it's on my side." Joan said calmly, "How do you know there's one? Did you see it?" Anne awoke, and out of habit she leaped out of bed and ran for the door squealing. Her mother squealed louder, and Anne, surprised, asked her what the trouble was. Her mother began pounding on the bed and yelling, "There's a big black spider in our room, in our bed, and it's on my side. Daddy said so. He saw it." Anne said, "But Mother, if there is a spider, why is Daddy in there?" Her mother paid no attention to her but continued to squeal, "Daddy said there was, and I'm scared." Joan said, "We'd better go in and look, Anne." So they solemnly marched in their mother's and Daddy's room. Mr. Russell was lying in bed gazing at the ceiling. Anne threw back the covers and Joan peered into the bed, but all they could see were their Daddy's feet and his toes wiggling. Anne said sternly, "Why did you scare Mother that way, Daddy?" Mr. Russell said, "Was she scared?" and jumped out of bed and ran into the bathroom shouting at the top of his voice, "Ha ha ha ha! First turn for the shower!" At that, Mr. Russell came flying in from the twins' room and began Mrs. Russell came flying in from the twins' room and began pounding on the bathroom door, yelling, "It's not your turn, it's mine. You traded me your first turn yesterday for a new golf ball." Mr. Russell laughed rudely and called out, "Too bad for you, I've got the door locked." Mrs. Russell kicked at the door and shouted, "Cheater, cheater, cheater!" Anne and Joan looked at each other. Their eyes were round with amazement. Anne whispered, "Let's get dressed," Joan said. And Joan said, "Yeah, let's hurry." And they tiptoed out of the room, closing the door carefully behind them. While they dressed, they could hear their mother and father quarreling. When Mr. Russell came out of the shower, Mrs. Russell said, "You used my towel. That's my towel." Mr. Russell said, "'Tis not, it's mine." Mrs. Russell said, "'Tis not, it's mine." Mr. Russell said, "Well, that's my new shirt. You've got on my new t-shirt." Mrs. Russell said, "Well, you wore my golf sweater." Mr. Russell said, "Take off my new shirt." Mrs. Russell began to bawl. She sobbed, "You wore my golf sweater and you promised me that I could wear your shirt. You're a pig." Mr. Russell said, "All right, baby, wear the old shirt." At breakfast, Mr. Russell took a little ruler out of his pocket and measured the grapefruit, and then he took the biggest. Mother snatched it away from him and spilled coffee on the new t-shirt. Mother served the scrambled eggs and gave herself a large heaping plate and Daddy a small serving. Daddy looked at both plates and said, "Pig." "Speaking of pigs," said Mrs. Russell, "it's my turn for the car." "'Tis not," said Mr. Russell. "It's my turn. You had the car last week." Mrs. Russell said, "I only drove up to the drugstore and back last week, and you went clear out to the golf club." Mr. Russell said in a very disagreeable way, "It makes no difference to me how far you drove. You had your turn, madam." Mrs. Russell began to bawl. "I think you're mean," she wailed. "Isn't it my turn, girls?" She turned to the twins. The girls looked at their mother, but they didn't answer. Instead, they asked to be excused, put on their coats, and hurried off to school. At dinner that night, Daddy took the chops up to the bathroom and weighed them on the scales, and then took the 2 biggest pork chops. Mother took the biggest baked potato, but she sorted the string beans out one by one so that everyone got an equal share. But they were ice cold when she finished. The twins cleared the table, and Ann carried in the pumpkin pie. Now, pumpkin pie was the twins' favorite dessert, and so Ann was very careful to walk slowly and put the pie down gently in front of Daddy. But it was a wasted effort, for Mother reached over and grabbed the pie, saying, "I'll serve that." "Oh, no, you won't," said Daddy, jerking the pie back. "We'll too," said Mother, reaching for the pie. But Daddy jerked it off the table and held it over his head. Mother grabbed his wrist, and the pie went splat all over the rug. The twins began to cry. They said, "Mommy, Daddy, please stop quarreling. We just can't stand it anymore. It's dreadful." Mother said, "Why, we thought you enjoyed fighting." Joan said, "We hate quarreling. We are so unhappy." Ann said, "Fighting is terrible. It makes us miserable." Mrs. Russell took Joan on her lap, and Mr. Russell took Ann on his lap, and they said, "To tell you the truth, girls, we don't like quarreling either. It is just a habit we caught from you." And this is a picture. That's them fighting over the pumpkin pie. Is it pumpkin pie? Sorry, I'm looking to see if it was pumpkin pie. Yeah, pumpkin pie. Okay. "Why, we must have been quarreling all day." The twins said, You have been fighting all day." Daddy said, "I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll all join hands and solemnly pledge that there shall be no more quarreling in this house. Then we'll all walk up to Finley's drugstore and seal the pledge with ice cream. Does everyone agree?" "We all agree," they shouted. So they joined hands and said, "I do solemnly pledge that I will not quarrel or fight in this house ever again." Then they walked up to Finley's drugstore and had ice cream, sodas, and even though Ann saw Mr. Finley put 3 scoops of ice cream in Joan's soda and only 2 in hers, and even though Joan saw Mr. Finley put 2 scoops of strawberry in Ann's soda and only 1 in hers, they neither of them said a word. The quarreleritis was cured. The end. That's the end of Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. And again, guys, this is a series of books. So there's Hello, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle is another book. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle's Magic and Happy Birthday, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle are all part of the series. So I just wanted to say I love you guys. I hope you have a wonderful summer. And I love you and I miss you. And I'll see you later. Bye.